I went to my stepfather's house and found my mother crying while kneeling on the floor cleaning. Everyone was shocked by what I did. I never thought I'd find myself standing here again at the end of this familiar gravel driveway in suburban Connecticut. The modest two-story house with its faded blue paint and white trim hadn't changed much in 15 years. The same creaky mailbox still stood at an angle, and Mrs. Peterson's rose bushes still peeked over the fence next door. But I had changed. From the Italian leather shoes on my feet to the platinum watch on my wrist, everything about me screamed success and distance from this place. My name is Alexander Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell Enterprises, and at 35, I'd built an empire from nothing. My company's latest acquisition had made headlines in the Wall Street Journal, and my face had graced the cover of Forbes last quarter. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of: a penthouse in Manhattan, a summer house in the Hamptons, and more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Yet here I was, drawn back to Maple Grove by a simple voicemail from Mrs. Peterson. "Alex, dear, I think you should come see your mother." The autumn wind rustled through the maple trees that gave our street its name, sending a shower of golden leaves spiraling down around me. I adjusted my tie, a nervous habit I'd developed during board meetings, and took the first step toward the house. Each crunch of gravel under my feet brought back memories. Riding my bike down this driveway, helping Mom plant her vegetable garden, the day I left for college with nothing but a scholarship and a duffel bag full of dreams. Mom had supported my ambitions, even when it meant being left behind. She'd worked double shifts at the local diner to help me through my first year, until I landed that life-changing internship at Goldman Sachs. After that, my visits became shorter and less frequent. Phone calls replaced Sunday dinners, and eventually, even those dwindled to holiday greetings and brief updates about my latest business ventures. I hadn't known what to expect when she remarried 5 years ago. Frank Stevens seemed decent enough during our brief meeting at the wedding, a retired accountant who promised to take care of her. I'd been too busy expanding my company into Asian markets to pay much attention to the details of their life together. Now, Mrs. Peterson's cryptic message and her worried tone made me question everything. As I approached the front porch, the screen door's familiar squeak caught my attention, but what I saw through the window stopped me in my tracks. There was my mother, on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor like Cinderella. Her once vibrant auburn hair had turned completely grey, and her shoulders stooped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. This wasn't the proud woman who had raised me single-handedly after Dad's passing, who had taught me that dignity was worth more than gold. Through the glass, I could see Frank's reflection in the hallway mirror, standing over her with his arms crossed, his mouth moving in what appeared to be harsh criticism. The scene made my blood run cold. This wasn't right. This wasn't the comfortable retirement I'd imagined for her, the life she deserved. I stood there frozen as 15 years of success suddenly felt hollow. What good was all my wealth if I couldn't protect the one person who had sacrificed everything for me? The weight of my neglect crashed down on my shoulders, heavier than any business decision I'd ever faced. A movement caught my eye. Frank had noticed me through the window. His expression shifted from domineering to accommodating so quickly it was almost imperceptible. But I'd spent years reading people across negotiating tables, and that split-second change told me everything I needed to know. Something was very wrong in this house. As I reached for the doorbell, my phone buzzed with a message from my assistant about an urgent board meeting in New York. For the first time in my career, I ignored it. The empire could wait. Right now, I needed to understand what had happened to my mother, and why the strong woman who had raised me was now kneeling on a floor under the watchful eye of a man who clearly wasn't who he claimed to be. Little did I know that pressing that doorbell would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel not just my mother's present situation, but long-buried secrets that would shake the very foundation of our family's history. The successful businessman in me knew how to solve problems with money and power, but the son in me was about to learn that some battles require more than just financial weapons to win. The chime echoed through the house, and I heard my mother's startled gasp, followed by the hurried sounds of her getting to her feet. As footsteps approached the door, I straightened my spine and put on the confident smile that had closed billion-dollar deals. This time, though, I wasn't here to negotiate a merger or acquire a company. I was here to reclaim something far more precious: my mother's dignity and the truth about what had been happening in the house I once called home. The door creaked open, revealing my mother's face, a face I knew better than my own yet somehow barely recognized. Her green eyes, once bright with laughter, now darted nervously between me and something, or someone, behind her. "Alex?" Her voice was a whisper, a far cry from the confident tone that used to call me in for dinner from 3 blocks away. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Frank appeared behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Up close, he looked older than I remembered, his salt and pepper hair now mostly salt, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of more than just age. "Well, if it isn't the prodigal son," Frank said, his tone jovial but his eyes cold. "To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" I stepped inside, the familiar scent of Mom's lavender potpourri mingling with something less pleasant, tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. "I was in the area," I lied smoothly, years of corporate poker faces serving me well. "Thought I'd surprise Mom." Mom's eyes lit up for a moment, but the spark quickly faded as Frank's grip on her shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly. That's wonderful, honey," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Let me put on some coffee." As she hurried off to the kitchen, I turned to Frank, sizing him up. He met my gaze steadily, a challenge lurking behind his affable exterior. "Shall we catch up in the living room?" he suggested, gesturing towards the space that had once been my childhood sanctuary. The living room had changed. Gone were Mom's colorful throw pillows and the mismatched furniture that had made the space so cozy. In their place stood austere leather armchairs and a glass coffee table that looked more suited to a corporate waiting room than a family home. "You've redecorated," I observed, taking a seat and noticing how Frank positioned himself between me and the kitchen. "Your mother and I decided it was time for a change," Frank replied smoothly. "Out with the old, in with the new, as they say." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I'd heard that tone before, from CEOs trying to cover up corporate malfeasance, from partners attempting to hide their embezzlement. It was the sound of a lie wrapped in a half-truth. "And how's retirement treating you, Frank?" I probed, watching his reaction carefully. A flicker of something. Annoyance? Worry crossed his face before he plastered on a smile. "Oh, you know how it is, keeping busy with this and that. Your mother and I have our routines." The way he said routines made me think of the scene I'd witnessed earlier, my mother on her knees, scrubbing floors like a servant. My jaw clenched, but years of boardroom battles had taught me the value of keeping my cards close to my chest. Mum returned with a tray of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set it down. I noticed a faded bruise on her wrist as she poured, partially hidden by her sleeve. My heart rate quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. "So, Alex," Frank said, leaning back in his chair, "tell us about your latest conquests in the business world. Your mother and I read about your company's expansion. Quite impressive." I launched into a sanitized version of my recent business dealings, all the while observing the dynamics between Frank and my mother. She sat perched on the edge of her seat, eyes downcast, speaking only when directly addressed by Frank. This was not the woman who had taught me to stand up for myself, who had worked tirelessly to give me opportunities she never had. As I talked, I noticed a stack of papers on the side table, partially obscured by a magazine. The letterhead caught my eye. Stevens Financial Services. Wasn't Frank supposed to be retired? "And that's how we closed the deal in Singapore," I finished, my mind racing. "Actually, Mom, I was hoping to take a look at some old photo albums, for nostalgia's sake. Are they still in the attic?" Before she could answer, Frank interjected, "Oh, I'm afraid we got rid of a lot of that old clutter. Spring cleaning, you know." The look of pain that flashed across my mother's face told me all I needed to know. Those albums had been her treasures, carefully curated memories of our family's history. "Well then," I said, standing up, "why don't I help Mom with dinner for old time's sake?" Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded, unable to find a reasonable objection. As we headed to the kitchen, I placed a gentle hand on my mother's back, feeling her tense at the touch. In the kitchen, away from Frank's watchful gaze, I turned to her. "Mom," I whispered, "what's going on? Are you okay?" She busied herself with the pots and pans, avoiding my eyes. "Everything's fine, Alex. Frank takes good care of me." "Mom, I saw you earlier, on the floor. That's not taking good care of you." Her hand stilled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But then she straightened her shoulders, a ghost of her old strength shining through. "You've been gone a long time, Alex. Things change, people change. The resignation in her voice broke my heart. This wasn't just about Frank's apparent mistreatment. There was something deeper here, something that had slowly eroded my mother's spirit over the years. "I'm here now, Mom," I said, gently turning her to face me. "And I'm not going anywhere until I understand what's happening." For a brief moment, hope flickered in her eyes. Then, like a candle snuffed out, it was gone, replaced by fear. "You can't fix everything with money, Alex," she whispered. "Some problems, some mistakes, they run too deep." Before I could press further, Frank's voice boomed from the living room, asking if we needed any help. The moment was gone, and Mom turned back to the stove, her walls firmly back in place. As I watched her mechanically prepare dinner, I made a silent vow. I would uncover the truth no matter where it led. The woman who had given everything for me deserved nothing less. And if Frank Stevens thought he could intimidate me or buy my silence, he was about to learn that he was dealing with a force far beyond his small-town machinations. Little did I know, the web of deceit I was about to unravel stretched far beyond this kitchen, beyond Frank, and into the very foundations of my family's past. The game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than any business deal I had ever encountered. This time, failure wasn't an option. My mother's future depended on it. The next morning, I woke early in my old bedroom, the twin bed barely accommodating my adult frame. Sleep had been elusive, my mind racing with questions and half-formed theories about what was really going on in this house. The sound of hushed voices drifted up from downstairs, punctuated by the occasional clink of dishes. I dressed quickly in jeans and a sweater, a far cry from my usual tailored suits. As I made my way down the creaky stairs, the voices fell silent. I found Mom and Frank in the kitchen, an atmosphere of unease hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "Good morning," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the tense atmosphere. "Something smells good." Mom managed a weak smile as she placed a plate of pancakes on the table. "I remembered they were your favorite." Frank folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness. "Alex," he nodded, his tone neutral but his eyes wary. "I trust you slept well in your old accommodations?" "Like a log," I lied, taking a seat at the table. "So, what's on the agenda for today?" Frank and Mom exchanged a quick glance before she spoke. "Oh, just the usual. I have some errands to run in town." "Perfect," I said, seizing the opportunity. "I'll come with you. It's been ages since I've seen the old place." Another loaded look passed between them. Frank cleared his throat. "Actually, Alex, I was hoping we could have a chat, man to man." The implication was clear. He wanted me out of the way, while Mom went to town alone. I smiled, channeling the calm demeanor that had served me well in countless negotiations. "Sounds great. We can talk while Mom's out." I insist on driving her to town first, though, for old time's sake. Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Of course, family time is important." 20 minutes later, I was behind the wheel of my rental car, Mom in the passenger seat beside me. As we pulled out of the driveway, I noticed Frank watching us from the living room window, his silhouette rigid and imposing. Once we were a safe distance from the house, I broke the silence. "Mom, what's really going on? And don't tell me everything's fine. I can see it's not." She stared out the window, her fingers worrying the hem of her cardigan. "It's complicated, Alex. There are things you don't understand." "Then help me understand," I pressed gently. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." She turned to me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Oh, Alex, you've always been so sure you could fix everything. But some things, some mistakes, they have roots that go back years, before you were even born." My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "What do you mean? What mistakes?" She took a deep breath, seeming to steel herself. "It's about your father and your Uncle Jim." I nearly swerved off the road. Uncle Jim, Dad's brother, had been a peripheral figure in my childhood, showing up for the occasional holiday before disappearing again for years at a time. "What about them?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she feared being overheard even here. "There were irregularities. In your father's business dealings, Jim was involved. So was Frank, though I didn't know it at the time." The pieces started to fall into place. Frank's questionable retirement, the Stevens financial services documents I'd glimpsed. "Are you saying they were involved in some kind of fraud?" She nodded, a tear finally escaping and trailing down her cheek. Your father suspected something was wrong. He was going to expose them, but then... The words hung in the air, unspoken. My father's sudden illness, his rapid decline. Could it have been more than just bad luck? Mum, I said, pulling the car over to the side of the road. Are you telling me that Frank and Uncle Jim had something to do with Dad's... I couldn't bring myself to say the word. She shook her head vehemently. No, at least I don't think so. But after your father was gone, they came to me with papers, said it was to protect the family, to protect you. I signed things I didn't understand. And now Frank has some kind of hold over you, I finished, the full picture finally coming into focus. She nodded miserably. The house, our savings, everything is tied up in ways I can't even begin to untangle. I'm trapped, Alex, and I've been too ashamed to tell you. I reached over and took her hand, feeling the tremors that ran through her. Listen to me, Mom. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You were trying to protect me. But now it's my turn to protect you. Whatever Frank and Jim did, whatever they're still doing, we're going to expose it. I promise you that. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw a glimmer of my old mom, the fighter, the survivor. It won't be easy, she warned. Frank has connections. And Jim, well, he's always been able to slither out of trouble. They haven't dealt with me yet, I said, a plan already forming in my mind. I've taken down corporate giants and outsmarted Wall Street sharks. A small-town fraudster and a deadbeat uncle don't stand a chance. As we pulled back onto the road and headed into town, I felt a newfound determination coursing through me. This wasn't just about saving my mother anymore. It was about justice. For her, for my father, and for every other victim of Frank and Jim's machinations. What I didn't know then was that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The web of deceit stretched further than I could have imagined, and untangling it would require every skill I'd honed in the cutthroat world of high finance. But as I glanced at my mother, seeing hope rekindled in her eyes, I knew that failure simply wasn't an option. The game was on, and I was playing for keeps. The drive back from town was charged with a newfound energy. Mom had run her errands, a thinly veiled excuse to get out of the house, while I had made some discreet inquiries around the old neighborhood. Small towns have long memories, and Maple Grove was no exception. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Frank peering through the curtains again. His constant surveillance was starting to feel less like concern and more like control. Remember, I whispered to Mom as we got out of the car, act normal. We don't want to tip him off. She nodded, squeezing my hand briefly before plastering on a smile and heading inside with her groceries. I lingered by the car, pulling out my phone and pretending to check emails while I processed what I'd learned in town. Old Mr. Johnson at the hardware store had been particularly illuminating. Frank Stevens, he'd said, lowering his voice, used to be quite the big shot around here, had his fingers in all sorts of pies, real estate, local politics, you name it. Then about 6-7 years ago, it all went quiet. Real quiet. Next thing we knew, he was retired and marrying your mom. The timing aligned perfectly with what Mom had told me. Whatever had gone down with Dad, Uncle Jim, and Frank had culminated around that time. But why had Frank suddenly gone quiet? And more importantly, how had he managed to maintain his hold over my mother all these years? I was pulled from my thoughts by Frank's voice from the porch. Alex, why don't you come inside? I believe we were going to have that chat. Showtime. I pocketed my phone and headed in, my guard up and senses alert. Frank led me to his study, a room that had once been Dad's workshop. The transformation was jarring. Gone were the warm wood scents and tools of my childhood, replaced by a sleek desk and walls lined with financial texts and bland corporate art. Drink? Frank offered, gesturing to a crystal decanter. No, thanks, I replied, taking a seat across from him. I prefer to keep a clear head. He smirked, pouring himself a generous glass. Always the businessman, eh? Well, let's get down to it then. What exactly are you doing here, Alex? I met his gaze steadily. I'm visiting my mother. Is that a crime? Of course not, he said smoothly. It's just unusual. You haven't exactly been a frequent visitor these past few years. Guilt gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. Things change. People change. Indeed they do, Frank mused, swirling his drink. Your mother, for instance. She's adapted well to our life together. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Has she? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's become more of a housekeeper than a wife. Frank's eyes hardened. Careful, Alex. You're treading on thin ice. What happens between a man and his wife is their business. It becomes my business when that wife is my mother, I shot back. And when I see evidence of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. For a split second, Frank's mask slipped, revealing a flash of panic before he regained composure. Those are serious accusations, my boy. I hope you have proof to back them up. I'm working on it, I said, leaning forward. Tell me, Frank, how does a retired accountant afford to redecorate so lavishly? Or are you not as retired as you claim? He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You always were a sharp one. Must get that from your father. He was inquisitive too. Look where that got him. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between us. I fought to keep my voice level. What exactly are you implying about my father? Frank stood, moving to the window. Nothing. Ancient history now. But let me give you some friendly advice, Alex. You've built quite a life for yourself in New York. It would be a shame to see it all come crashing down because you couldn't leave well enough alone. I stood as well, my hands clenched at my sides. Is that a threat? He turned, his face a mask of faux concern. A warning from a stepfather who only wants the best for his family. Some stones are better left unturned, for everyone's sake. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Mum peeked in, her eyes darting nervously between us. Dinner's ready, she said quietly. The tension in the room was palpable. Frank's smile returned, all teeth and no warmth. Wonderful timing, dear. Alex and I were just finishing up our little chat, weren't we, Alex? I nodded stiffly, my mind racing. As we headed to the dining room, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever secrets Frank was hiding, they went deeper than I had imagined, and he was willing to go to great lengths to keep them buried. Dinner was a tense affair, with Mom trying desperately to maintain a facade of normalcy, while Frank and I engaged in a verbal chess match, each probing for weaknesses in the other's armor. As I helped Mom clear the dishes afterward, I whispered, "We need to talk, tonight after he's asleep." She hesitated, then gave an almost imperceptible nod. Later that night, as the old house creaked and settled, I crept downstairs to find Mom waiting in the kitchen, a shoebox clutched to her chest. "I've kept these hidden for years," she whispered, opening the box to reveal a stack of old letters and documents. "Your father's records. He was close to exposing everything when he left us." As we pored over the papers by the dim light of the range hood, a chilling picture began to emerge. Dad had uncovered a complex web of fraud and embezzlement, with Frank and Uncle Jim at its center. But the conspiracy reached further, into local government, law enforcement, even the state level. "Mom," I breathed, the magnitude of the situation hitting me. "This is huge. We need to get you out of here tonight." She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I can't, Alex. Frank has safeguards in place. If I leave, if anything happens to him, everything comes out. Your career, our family name, it would all be destroyed." I took her hands in mine, feeling the weight of years of silent suffering in her trembling fingers. "Listen to me. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I won't let him keep using you as a shield for his crimes." A floorboard creaked overhead and we froze. After a moment of tense silence, I quickly helped Mom return the documents to their hiding place. As I headed back to my room, my mind was whirling with plans and possibilities. One thing was clear. I needed help. This was bigger than anything I could handle alone. Lying in bed, I made a decision. First thing in the morning, I would reach out to Sarah Chen, my company's head of legal affairs. If anyone could help navigate this minefield of legal and financial intricacies, it was her. What I didn't know then was that my late-night discovery session hadn't gone unnoticed. Even as I plotted our next move, other forces were aligning against us. The quiet war for truth and justice in Maple Grove was about to escalate, and the casualties would be higher than anyone could have predicted. The next morning I woke before dawn, my mind still racing from the revelations of the night before. I slipped out of the house quietly, not wanting to risk another confrontation with Frank before I had a chance to strategize. The cool morning air felt refreshing as I walked to a nearby park, seeking both privacy and a clear signal for my phone. Settling on a bench, I dialed Sarah Chen's number, hoping she wouldn't mind the early call. Sarah had been my rock through countless corporate battles, her legal acumen matched only by her unwavering loyalty. "Alex?" Her voice was alert despite the hour. "What's wrong?" You never call this early unless it's an emergency. Sarah, I need your help, I said, quickly outlining the situation. The fraud, the threats, the years of manipulation. This goes beyond anything we've dealt with before. It's not just business, it's personal. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her tone was resolute. I'm on the next flight out. Don't do anything until I get there. And Alex, watch your back. Men like Frank Stevens don't play by the rules. As I ended the call, a sense of relief washed over me. With Sarah on our side, we stood a fighting chance, but my relief was short-lived. Making early morning calls, Alex? The voice behind me made me jump. I turned to see Uncle Jim standing there, a jovial smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Must be important business to drag you out of bed at this hour. I stood, my guard immediately up. Uncle Jim, I didn't expect to see you here. He chuckled, taking a seat on the bench and patting the spot next to him. Oh, I like to take walks in the morning. Helps clear the head. Why don't you join me? We have a lot to catch up on. Reluctantly, I sat down, maintaining a careful distance. Jim had always been the charismatic one, smooth-talking and quick with a joke. But now, knowing what I did, I could see the calculation behind his friendly demeanor. So, he began, his tone conversational, how are you finding your visit home? Quite a change from the big city, I imagine. It's been enlightening, I replied carefully. Things aren't quite as I remembered them. Jim nodded sagely. Things change, people change. You've done well for yourself, Alex. Your father would be proud. The mention of my father sent a surge of anger through me. Would he? Or would he be disappointed to see what's become of his family, his legacy? For a moment, Jim's mask slipped, a flash of something, fear, anger, crossing his face before the affable smile returned. Now, let's not dwell on the past. What's done is done. The question is, what happens next? I met his gaze steadily. That depends. On you, on Frank, on how willing you are to make things right. Jim leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Listen to me carefully, Alex. You're playing a game you don't understand, with stakes higher than you can imagine. Frank may seem like the villain here, but trust me, there are bigger fish. Walk away now, forget what you think you know, and everyone stays safe. Push this and, well, he trailed off, the threat hanging unspoken in the air between us. I stood, my fists clenched at my sides. Is that what you told my father? To walk away? To forget what he knew? Jim's expression hardened. Your father made his choices. Don't make the same mistakes. As I turned to leave, Jim called after me. Think about your mother, Alex, about your career. Some truths are better left buried. I walked away, my mind reeling. Jim's warnings only confirmed what I already suspected. This conspiracy ran deeper than I'd imagined. But his threats had the opposite of their intended effect. I was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and bring those responsible to justice. Returning to the house, I found Mom in the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Everything okay? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. Help is on the way. We're not alone in this fight anymore. As I helped her prepare breakfast, I filled her in on Sarah's impending arrival and my encounter with Uncle Jim, careful to keep my voice low. Mum's hands shook as she whispered, "Be careful, Alex. These men, they're capable of anything." Before I could respond, Frank's heavy footsteps on the stairs silenced our conversation. He entered the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as he took in our proximity. Well, isn't this cozy? The prodigal son home to help his mother with breakfast. The tension in the room was palpable. I met Frank's gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. Family helps family, isn't that right, Frank? His smile was cold. Indeed. Speaking of family, I just got off the phone with your Uncle Jim. Says he ran into you this morning. Had quite an interesting chat. I felt Mom stiffen beside me. Oh? I said, keeping my tone neutral. And what did dear Uncle Jim have to say? Frank's eyes glittered dangerously. He seems to think you might be confused about certain family matters, digging into things best left alone. I do hope that's not the case. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang, breaking the tense standoff. Frank frowned. Expecting someone? That would be for me, I said, moving past him towards the door. A colleague from New York. Legal counsel. The look on Frank's face as I opened the door to reveal Sarah, briefcase in hand and determination in her eyes, was almost worth the price of admission. The game was changing, and Frank knew it. Sarah stepped inside, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the homey kitchen. "Mr. Stevens, Mrs. Stevens," she nodded politely before turning to me. "Alex, we have a lot to discuss." As we moved to the living room, leaving a stunned Frank in our wake, I felt a surge of hope. With Sarah here, we had a fighting chance. But I also knew that we had just escalated the conflict. Frank and Jim wouldn't take this lying down. The quiet war for truth in Maple Grove was about to become a full-blown battle, and I could only hope we were prepared for what was to come. The living room felt like a war room as Sarah spread documents across the coffee table. Mom sat nervously on the edge of the sofa, while Frank hovered in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Mr. Stevens," Sarah said, her tone professional but firm, "I think it would be best if you joined us. What we're about to discuss concerns you directly." Frank's jaw clenched, but he stepped into the room, taking a seat in his armchair like a king on a throne. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing here, Ms. Chen, but I can assure you—" Sarah cut him off with a raised hand. "What I'm doing, Mr. Stevens, is protecting my client's interests. And right now, those interests extend to uncovering the truth about some very troubling financial and legal matters involving this family." I watched as Sarah laid out the evidence we had gathered. Dad's old documents, financial records I had quietly obtained through my business connections, and testimonies from townsfolk who had been affected by Frank and Jim's schemes over the years. "As you can see," Sarah continued, her voice steady, "we have enough here to launch a full investigation. Fraud, embezzlement, coercion, the list goes on. Now, we're prepared to go to the authorities with this, but I thought it only fair to give you a chance to explain your side of the story first." Frank's face had gone pale, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous twitch. "This is absurd. You have no proof, no real evidence. Just the ramblings of a dead man and some small-town gossip." "Oh, I think we have more than that," I interjected, pulling out my phone. "You see, Frank, while you were busy trying to intimidate my mother, I was busy too, setting up recordings, gathering digital evidence. Did you really think I'd come back here without a plan?" The color drained from Frank's face as I played a snippet of our conversation from his study, his thinly veiled threats now preserved as damning evidence. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Frank, how could you?" For a moment it seemed like Frank might crumble under the weight of the evidence. But then something changed in his eyes, a hardness, a resolve. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, boy," he snarled. "This goes far beyond me, beyond your precious family drama. You think you're clever with your recordings and your hotshot lawyer? You're playing with fire and you're going to get burned." Sarah leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. "Is that a threat, Mr. Stevens? Because I can assure you we're more than prepared to—" She was cut off by the sound of the front door slamming open. Heavy footsteps approached, and suddenly Uncle Jim was there, flanked by two men I didn't recognize, one in a police uniform, the other in an expensive suit that screamed government official. "Well, well," Jim said, his jovial mask gone, replaced by cold determination. "Looks like we're having a family reunion. Mind if we join?" The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Sarah stood, positioning herself between us and the newcomers. "Gentlemen, this is a private meeting. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man in the suit stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Agent Harding, FBI, I'm afraid we can't do that, Miss Chen. We have some questions for Mr. Mitchell here about some irregularities in his recent business dealings." My heart raced. This was a setup, a counterattack I hadn't anticipated. I looked at Sarah, seeing the same realization in her eyes. They were trying to turn the tables to make me the target. "Alex has done nothing wrong," Mom said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. She stood, facing down the men who had dominated her life for so long. "If anyone should be answering questions, it's you, Jim. You and Frank and all your cronies who've been bleeding this town dry for years." Jim's face darkened. "Sit down, Evelyn. You're out of your depth here." "No," I said, standing beside my mother. "She's not, and neither am I. You want to play hardball? Fine, let's play. But remember, I've got friends in high places too, and unlike you, I'm not afraid of the truth coming out." Agent Harding looked uncertain for a moment, glancing between Jim and me. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion down at the station," he suggested. Sarah stepped in, her lawyer mode in full force. "My client will be happy to answer any questions you have, Agent Harding." but only in the presence of legal counsel, and only after we've had a chance to review any alleged evidence you might have." The standoff continued, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife, but I could see the first cracks appearing in their united front. The local cop looked increasingly uncomfortable, while Agent Harding seemed to be reassessing the situation. Just then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Rooftop 5 minutes, come alone next and E." I exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever was happening, we needed more information, more leverage. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart, "I think we all need a moment to cool down and consider our positions. Why don't we reconvene in an hour? I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding without further escalation." Jim looked like he wanted to object, but Agent Harding nodded. "1 hour, Mr. Mitchell. Don't go far." As they filed out, Frank following in their wake like a deflated balloon, I turned to Sarah and Mom. "I need a few minutes. There's someone I have to meet." "Be careful," Mom whispered, squeezing my hand. I nodded, heading for the stairs. Whoever M was, they might be the key to unraveling this whole mess. As I climbed towards the rooftop, I steeled myself for whatever revelation awaited me. The game had changed, the stakes higher than ever, but I was determined to see it through no matter the cost. Little did I know, the conversation I was about to have would change everything, shaking the very foundations of what I thought I knew about my family, this town, and the dark secrets lurking beneath its surface. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rooftop as I pushed open the access door. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Who was this mysterious M, and what could they possibly know that would change the game? I scanned the rooftop, seeing no one at first. Then, a movement caught my eye. From behind, an old water tank stepped a woman, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight. It took me a moment to recognize her, Margaret Peterson, our old neighbor. The same Mrs. Peterson who had left that cryptic voicemail that brought me back to Maple Grove. "Alex," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." I approached cautiously, my mind racing. "Mrs. Peterson, you're M? What's going on? Why all the secrecy?" She glanced nervously over her shoulder before facing me again. "Because, Alex, what I'm about to tell you could get me into a lot of trouble. Maybe worse, but I can't stay silent anymore. Not after seeing what they've done to your mother, to this town." Mrs. Peterson reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Your father gave this to me for safekeeping, just days before he left us. He made me promise to keep it hidden until the time was right. I think that time is now." With trembling hands, I took the envelope. Inside were documents, photos, and a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. "Alex," it began, "if you're reading this, then things have gone very wrong. The corruption in Maple Grove runs deeper than you can imagine. Frank and Jim are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a network, son, politicians, judges, even federal agents. They've been using our town and others like it to launder money and influence for years." I looked up at Mrs. Peterson, my mind reeling. How deep does this go?" She shook her head sadly. "Your father was close to exposing it all. Too close. That's why he's gone." The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. All these years I'd believed my father's passing was natural, if sudden, but this changed everything. "There's more," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Your Uncle Jim, he wasn't always part of this. He tried to help your father at first, but they got to him, threatened his family. That's why he turned." I flipped through the documents, seeing names I recognized, local officials, state representatives, even a few national figures. The web of corruption was vast and intricate. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears. "Because I saw you come back. I saw the fire in your eyes, the same fire your father had. And I knew it was time. Alex, you're not alone in this fight. There are others, people in town who've been waiting for a chance to bring this all down. We just needed a catalyst. You." As the weight of this revelation settled on me, I heard the rooftop door open behind us. I spun around, half expecting to see Frank or Jim or one of their cronies. Instead, I saw Sarah, her face etched with concern. "Alex," she said, breathless, We've got a problem. Your mother, she's gone, and Frank with her." My blood ran cold. "What? How?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. I stepped out to make a call. And when I came back, the house was empty. There was a note. It says if we want to see her again, we need to hand over all the evidence." Immediately, I clutched the envelope to my chest, my mind racing. They must have realized how much we knew, how close we were to exposing everything. Taking Mum was their last desperate play. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. "There's a network of us, Alex. People your father trusted. We can help." I looked between her and Sarah, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just about clearing my family's name anymore. It was about justice for an entire community, maybe even beyond. "Okay," I said, my resolve hardening. "Here's what we're going to do. Sarah, I need you to start making calls. Every contact we have in law enforcement that we can trust. Mrs. Peterson, gather your network. We're going to need eyes and ears all over town." As they nodded, determination replacing fear in their eyes, I felt a surge of hope. We were no longer fighting alone in the shadows. The light was about to shine on Maple Grove's darkest secrets. "And me," I continued, a plan forming in my mind. "I'm going to give Frank and Jim exactly what they want. A meeting. But this time we're setting the terms." As we hurried back down from the rooftop, the pieces of our counterattack falling into place, I couldn't help but think of my father. His fight had become my fight. And this time, we had a chance to finish what he started. The next few hours would determine everything, not just the fate of my mother, but the future of Maple Grove itself. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, I steeled myself for the confrontation to come. The final act was about to begin, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The old Maple Grove Community Center stood silent in the gathering dusk, its windows dark save for a single light in the main hall. This was where it all began, where town meetings and local elections had been held for generations, and where, unbeknownst to most, the seeds of corruption had been sown. I stood at the entrance, the weight of my father's documents heavy in my briefcase, and the weight of responsibility even heavier on my shoulders. Sarah stood beside me, her usual professional demeanor tinged with worry. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" she asked, her voice low. "We could still call in the authorities, try to handle this through official channels." I shook my head. "No, this ends here, tonight, on our terms." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Remember the plan. No matter what happens in there, stick to it." She nodded, and together we pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The main hall was dimly lit, the long shadows creating an eerie atmosphere. At the far end I could make out 3 figures, Frank, Uncle Jim, and between them, looking small but defiant, my mother. "Alex!" Frank called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "So good of you to join us. I trust you've brought what we asked for." I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. "I have, but first let my mother go." Jim chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. Now, Alex, you know that's not how this works. The documents first, then we'll talk about dear Evelyn here." I locked eyes with my mother, seeing a mixture of fear and determination in her gaze. She gave me a small nod, and I knew she understood what was about to happen. "All right," I said, placing my briefcase on a nearby table. "You want the truth? Here it is." I opened the case, pulling out a stack of papers. Everything my father uncovered, everything Mrs. Peterson kept safe all these years, the names, the dates, the transactions, it's all here. Frank stepped forward eagerly, his eyes gleaming with greed and desperation. But before he could reach the documents, the room was suddenly flooded with light. Doors burst open on all sides as police officers poured in, led by Agent Harding, the real Agent Harding, not the imposter from earlier. "FBI, nobody move!" Harding's voice boomed through the hall. The look of shock and betrayal on Frank and Jim's faces was almost comical. In the chaos that followed, I rushed to my mother's side, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" I whispered, feeling her trembling in my arms. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Alex. Your father would be too." As the FBI agents handcuffed Frank and Jim, reading them their rights, Sarah approached us, a satisfied smile on her face. It worked. The recording devices we planted caught everything. Their confession, the names of their co-conspirators, all of it. I looked around the room, seeing Mrs. Peterson and other townspeople emerging from hiding spots, having witnessed everything. Their faces showed a mixture of shock, relief, and hope, the first glimmers of a town ready to reclaim its soul. In the days that followed, Maple Grove was turned upside down. The investigation expanded, reaching into every corner of local government and beyond. Names were named, charges were filed, and slowly but surely, the web of corruption began to unravel. But amidst the chaos and legal battles, something beautiful began to emerge. The people of Maple Grove, long silenced by fear and manipulation, found their voices again. Town meetings became forums for real change, with new faces stepping up to lead the community towards a brighter future. My mother, no longer bowed by years of abuse and fear, became a pillar of strength for other survivors. Together, we established the Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of financial fraud and domestic abuse, ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in silence as she had. As for me, I found myself at a crossroads. The corporate world that had once defined me now seemed hollow in comparison to the fight for justice we had waged in Maple Grove. With Sarah's encouragement, I decided to shift my focus, using my business acumen and resources to support small towns like ours in rooting out corruption and rebuilding their communities. On a warm summer evening, almost a year after that fateful confrontation, I stood on the porch of our old family home. Mum had decided not to sell it after all, instead turning it into a sanctuary for those in need. As I watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a presence beside me. "You did good, son," my mother said, slipping her arm through mine. "You brought the light back to Maple Grove." I smiled, thinking of my father, of the legacy he had left, and the torch I had picked up. "We did it together, Mom. All of us." As we stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade away, I knew that while the battle for Maple Grove was over, our work was far from done. There were other towns, other corrupt officials, other families suffering in silence. But now we had hope, and the knowledge that with courage, perseverance, and the strength of community, even the deepest shadows could be brought into the light. The crickets began their evening chorus, a sound that had once been background noise but now seemed like a celebration of renewal. Maple Grove had faced its demons and emerged stronger, its people united in a way they hadn't been in generations. As night fell on our little town, I realized that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A new chapter, not just for me and my mother, but for everyone who called Maple Grove home. And whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger and more resolute than ever before.